Moving right along, we just did perfect competition. Now we need to do the other extreme, and the other extreme is monopoly. Here we go. Remember perfect competition. We have lots and lots of small sellers, right? Farmers, lots and lots of them. They're small. They can't influence the market. It's easy to start up one of these businesses. And they're producing these identical products so that no one has any influence or say over what happens in the market. Now we're going to blow all those assumptions up and go the other way. So mono means one. So a monopoly is when there is one seller. NV Energy is an electrical monopoly in southern Nevada. They're the only place you can buy electricity in southern Nevada. One seller. For this to work, there have to be no close substitutes. There can't be something else that you can pick that does the same thing. No close substitutes. And electricity, hard to find a substitute. Again, you could put solar on your house, but you have to pay a fee to NV Energy to do that, the way our system works, and we'll talk about that. If you want to go off the grid, if you want to not use NV Energy, you have to pay. Close substitutes. Let me give you an example from the real world. The government once sued Saran Wrap for being a monopoly. And their argument was that Saran Wrap was the only clear plastic wrap that anybody could buy. It's a monopoly, blah, blah, blah. The government lost that case. And they lost that case because the jury said, oh, government, there's aluminum foil, there's wax paper, there's parchment paper, there's Tupperware, there's 10 things that can do what clear plastic wrap does. When there are closed substitutes, you're not a monopoly. Okay? And then 3, there has to be basically total barriers to entry. There has to be a way to stop a new company from coming in. And in fact, if you wanted to start up a new electrical company and sell electricity, the government would stop you. And we need to talk about all this. Okay? So one seller, no closed substitutes, and total barriers to entry. A barrier to entry means startup, right? Entry. No new competitors can come in. There's something blocking the competition. All right, so here's a list of barriers, and then we'll talk about each barrier more in depth. Barrier number 1 is what we call natural barriers, natural monopoly. Barrier number 2 is a barrier that happens because somebody owns something. Barrier number 3 are legal barriers set up by the legal system. And barrier number 4 is what we call network externalities. And over there I have Microsoft Windows, which is not a monopoly, but somewhat close. And we'll talk about that too. All right, natural monopoly. Economists believe that there are some businesses that if we left them alone, no matter what we do, they will always turn into a monopoly. And how does that happen? Well, it happens because there are some businesses where the more I produce, the lower my costs are. Where the average cost curve, instead of being this U-shaped thing we've been drawing all along, just goes down and keeps going down. For a long time, there was only one aluminum smelter in the United States. The reason being that aluminum smelting is incredibly electrical intensive and other things, so that the bigger the smelter, the lower the costs, up to a point where we hadn't reached yet. And that meant that nobody new could come into the market because their costs would be so high they couldn't charge a reasonable price for their product and compete against the existing company. So there are people who believe that electrical energy is this way, that There's a declining cost as you get larger. Think about all of the cables and wires you have to move all over the world and all over the country and stuff you have to do. So there are people who believe that electrical power might really just be a natural monopoly, that bigger companies are going to have lower costs than smaller companies. If bigger companies have lower costs than smaller companies, the big guys will always drive the little guys out of business. The big guys will be able to make a profit at a price below which the little guys can't even sell. So the big guy is saying, hey, this is my price. It's a reasonable economic price based on my costs. Little guys can't compete. They're going out of business. What you get is the big guys getting bigger and the little guys going away. Okay. So a natural monopoly is an industry where the largest company can always produce at the lowest cost, and the smaller your company, the higher your costs, just by the nature of business. Without the big company having to do anything about it, they will destroy the little companies. It's natural. There was talk at one point about splitting Microsoft up into a number of other companies. It's likely that if the government had done that, given 4 companies the rights to Windows instead of 1, that we'd end up some point with just 1 again. Okay? There are things that just become monopolies naturally. Ownership. Resources are scarce. Some resources are more scarcer than others. If you own a scarce resource, if you control that resource, you have a monopoly. The current thing that everybody's worried about is cobalt. Cobalt is a naturally occurring mineral that only occurs in a few places on Earth, and folks from China own almost all of those cobalt mines. They're going to eventually have a monopoly, it's thought, over cobalt because they own the scarce natural resource. Cobalt is used in batteries. Every battery you own has cobalt in it. Without a supply of cobalt, then we have a problem with batteries, and there's really, you don't want a laptop that has to carry around old school nickel cadmium batteries. Okay. Diamonds are the traditional example that economists give. There's a South African company called De Beers. If you know your geology, you know that all diamond mines are in really old, deep volcanoes. The diamonds are created way down under the ground. Not tens of thousands of feet, but, well, it could be even. Way deep in the underground. Pressure and heat create diamonds from anything made out of copper. There's people who've made diamonds in a laboratory out of peanut butter. Pressure and heat on coal, on any source of carbon. Those diamonds are in certain deep volcanoes. That's the only place they are. So there's limited places on Earth where we're going to find diamonds. Not very many, right? So Southern Africa was where most of the diamond mines in the world were, and one company owned all of those mines. Diamonds are not actually scarce relative to other gemstones. Diamonds are actually a very plentiful stone. And now there are mines elsewhere on Earth, and of course there are machine-made diamonds now, and we human beings know how to make diamonds, and we're getting better at it all the time. De Beers controlled the diamond market. What they did was to restrict the number of diamonds that were sold, and by restricting the amount of diamonds that were sold, they were able to make diamonds expensive. Plus, they convinced everybody that they needed to own diamonds. And even now, even though other diamond mines, particularly in Russia, have been found, De Beers still is working that market for them and is working to keep the price up as if they were a monopoly, even though they might not be so much anymore. The market still acts that way because De Beers still controls it, and they're not a nice company. You shouldn't be buying diamonds that are coming from them. Anyway, What happens if a country has one port, one river, one well, one of something? You can get a monopoly by controlling some physical natural resource, geologic natural resource, like a port, like a river, like a lake. So if there's a country and only has one seaport, then whoever owns that seaport has a monopoly of cargo in and out of the country. Okay? So if you own the right thing, you too can be a monopoly. Most monopolies in the world today are created by governments. Let me say that again. Most monopolies in the world are created by governments. They are created by legal barriers. Okay? The number one thing that we notice most is probably what's called the public franchise. Governments, mostly city, state, county governments, don't want a whole bunch of companies running around. Imagine that you have multiple cable companies and power companies and gas companies in your town, and instead of 3 companies digging up the roads all the time, there are 10 companies digging. No. Okay? So most cities in America, there is one power company, one gas company, one trash company, one cable company, one telephone company, one landline telephone company. Anybody who needs to use the underground system and needs to occasionally do stuff like dig up roads, the government wants to minimize the number of them that exist, and so we create these public franchises. Just like McDonald's franchises stores, and you can't put a McDonald's on a corner without McDonald's permission. You have to get a franchise from them to start a McDonald's on some corner. You have to get a franchise from the government, which is called a public franchise, to start a trash company or a power company. Right? If you're thinking that this can lead to all kinds of bad outcomes, of course it can. There were county commissioners here in Las Vegas who went to jail for some bad behavior with regard to the trash company contract. So it's not always in the best interests of the public, but it should be, and we'll talk about that. There's an advantage in not having to rip up the roads. Same time, the government's going to have to regulate this, and we'll talk about that toward the end here, how the government regulates it when you set up the monopoly. The other government-created monopolies are patents and copyrights. If you've ever read the Constitution of the United States of America, it allows the U.S. government to create a system of patent and copyright to protect, it says, for a limited time, the rights of authors and creators and innovators and so on. Limited time is not very limited anymore on some things. I put a pill bottle up there. If you invent a new drug, you get to be a monopoly for 17 years. The point of that is, if I'm going to invent this new drug, I should make sure that I can get some money back for it. It's very expensive to invent drugs. You want to invent some new drug that takes care of some new terrible disease that's sweeping the planet Earth, you should get paid for doing that. You get a patent. You invent some new way, you invent warp drive, and now we can go to planets all over the universe. You should be able to get some money off of that, and you do that by getting your idea, your invention, a patent, and then for a period of time, and for most of these kind of inventions, it's like 17 years, you have the exclusive monopoly right to profit from that invention. Okay? Copyrights are weirder. Copyrights are on intellectual property. Copyrights are on books and movies and songs and all that. And the government gives you a copyright on those kind of things is your life plus 50 years. So I put J.K. Rowling up here. Her life plus 50 years. It's highly likely that the copyright on Harry Potter is going to extend well after 2100. And that seems like a really long time when the Constitution says for a short time. But we can argue about that, and you need to take more econ classes, and you can spend some time talking about that. Okay? So this is where most monopolies come from. They're public franchises, or they own a patent, or they own a copyright. And from that, they create this monopoly. The last barrier that there is something called network externalities. Network externalities is a simple idea. It's the idea that there's an advantage to all of us having the same software. In the days when PCs first came out in the 80s, there were over 100 different word processing programs in the world. There were more than 30 different software programs in use at UNLV. Professors sometimes couldn't share documents with each other because their word processors couldn't talk to each other. When everybody's using Windows, or almost everybody's using Windows, now we can take a Word doc and send it to each other. Or we can do the Adobe thing and get a PDF and send the PDF to each other. By having just a few pieces of software that all of us use, it lowers our training costs, it lowers our support costs, and it just makes the users' lives easier. Those are network externalities. There's an advantage to all of us basically being on this big Word or Excel or PDF network. Okay? Same thing applies to search engines. We can all use the same search engine. It's easy. And tell me, each generation uses different social media platforms. We don't all use, all of a sudden there's TikTok and, Instagram, and social media started with something called MySpace, which doesn't even exist anymore, and then Facebook became the thing. Facebook started out as only being for universities, and then it went public to everybody. But what would happen if you had 100 actual friends, not fake internet friends, but 100 actual friends, and each one of them was on a different program? Your life would be miserable. Your life works because you and all your friends are on 2 or 3 maybe platforms at the most, and you really can follow each other and see what's going on. If there's 20 or 30 or 40 of these, there's competition, but it's not competition that's good for the consumer. So there's a theory that says in things like software, we're always going to end up with 1 or 2 or 3. And that's to our advantage. There's such a huge advantage in everybody using the same thing that these are good monopolies, these network externality monopolies. All right? We'll talk about that some more too before we're done today.